thank you very much for inviting me. So since this is a little bit long, I will start right away. The luminous figure of Dante cast a long shadow over the modern literary imagination. The brilliance of the Commedia radiated widely over several generations of 20th century writers, including the Inklings. C.S. Lewis in particular hailed Dante as, quote, a strong candidate for the supreme poetical honors of the world. And he drew inspiration from the Florentine poet's masterpiece and other writings for his project of infusing new life into old tales. Lewis published scholarly papers on the Divine Comedy and encouraged Tolkien, Charles Lewis, among others in their literary circle, to join the Oxford Dante Society in the 1940s. I will focus on some aspects of Lewis's relevant prose writings on Dante, as well on two of his novels later on in the lecture. I want to begin, however, by invoking the jovial author of The Everlasting Man, a book Lewis described in a 1947 letter as the best popular defense of the full Christian position. And later he listed it as one of the top 10 books that most shaped his vocational attitude and philosophy of life. In a well-known passage from his autobiography titled Surprised by Joy, Lewis noted that G.K. Chesterton was one of two writers who gently nudged him towards Christianity. And here's that passage. In reading Chesterton, as in reading MacDonald, I did not know what I was letting myself in for. A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. So Lewis credited George MacDonald with baptizing his imagination, that's his phrase, and Chesterton with christening his mind. Lewis dramatized his experience of religious conversion in Dantesque fashion in The Great Divorce, a book published in 1946. And in a pivotal scene from that dream vision, the pilgrim narrator, who represents the fictional Lewis, is astonished to meet in person the 19th century novelist and Scottish clergyman he so much admired. Lewis greets George MacDonald, who will act as his Virgilian guide, Virgil, the Latin poet who guides Dante through the regions of the afterlife, and so MacDonald performs the same function in The Great Divorce. So this is the fictional Lewis's reaction on seeing him. He says, I tried trembling to tell this man all that his writing had done for me. I tried to tell how a certain frosty afternoon at Leatherhead Station, when I first bought a copy of Phantastes, a novel, being then about 16 years old, had been to me what the first sight of Beatrice had been to Dante. Here begins the new life. Like his close friend Charles Williams, Lewis had become captivated by the medieval poet's account of how he had been led to salvation by the greeting of a young girl named Beatrice on the streets of Florence. It might seem odd that Lewis chose to use this story about love at first sight to describe his own unforgettable encounter with his spiritual mentor. And yet, reading Dante's autobiographical work titled La Vita Nuova, The New Life, which of course MacDonald refers to, or Lewis, fictional Lewis refers to in that passage I just read, was a defining moment for Lewis in helping him to understand that one who walks along the romantic way, as Charles Williams called it, will seek the object of his heart's desire in different transitional modes, whether this mode occurs through love of a person, such as Beatrice, or love of a thing, such as Phantastes, the novel. As Lewis himself described the effect of reading Chesterton in Surprised by Joy, this is what he says. He says, liking an author may be as involuntary and improbable as falling in love. The heart and mind and love, then, represent complementary expressions of the whole being of an individual who is in the process of being drawn by a Beatrician experience towards a higher love. Like his great medieval predecessor, Lewis was steeped in St. Augustine's affective theology, which was based on the understanding of virtue as rightly ordered love. That is to say, all created goods are to be loved in the proper measure by referring them to the Creator. Dante, in fact, had used the Augustinian exhortation, "Set my loves in order," as the epigraph for the second part of the Divine Comedy, and has Virgil, who is his guide, expound the central principle that love is the seed of every virtue and of all acts deserving punishment. Natural love, he says, which compels all things to act according to their natures, is always good. Endowed with the gift of free will, human beings also benefit from having mental love that can choose its object. And here are the relevant verses from that passage. As long as it's directed towards the first good and tends towards secondary goods with measure, it cannot be the cause of evil pleasure. But when it twists towards evil, those whom he made have worked against their maker. Lewis has MacDonald impart a concise version of the same Virgilian teaching in The Great Divorce, and this is the way he puts it. There's something in natural affection which will lead it on to eternal love, but there's also something in it which makes it easier to stop at the natural level and mistake it for the heavenly. Brass is mistaken for gold more easily than clay is. The corruption of the natural affections, in other words, if they're left unchecked, leads to what he calls the false religion of lust. Dante applies an Augustinian approach to reading books as well. In other words, to underline the function of literature as the mediation of desire. In one of his works called De Doctrina Christiana, Augustine famously articulated the fundamental distinction between enjoying a text for its own sake and using its literal sense in order to understand spiritual truth. The first approach results in carnal enjoyment, the kind illustrated by Augustine himself in the Confessions, when he recounts his seductive reading of the story of Dido in Virgil's Aeneid. In similar fashion, Dante presents a classic case of misreading in the famous episode of the adulterous lovers, Francesca and Paolo, in Inferno 5. Francesca falls victim to a tortuous process of self-deception in the telling of her tale. To her mind, the affair began innocently enough. She and Paolo had been perusing a French Arthurian romance about Lancelot and Guinevere, when an irresistible force suddenly seized them, and that day they read no more. The terse understatement unwittingly reveals her mixed motives. Francesca blames the book for what had transpired next, but the irony lies in the fact that the passionate readers never got to the end of the story. By stopping at the point of no return, they missed the key moral lesson, the condemnation of Lancelot's infidelity and the resulting failure of his quest for the Holy Grail, contained in the original text. Francesca's attempt at evading responsibility also failed because her mental and moral confusion prevents her from seeing her sin for what it truly is. Francesca, moreover, is unable to turn her erotic reading into a charitable resolution. The keynote of her speech on the power of love ironically echoes some earlier testimony on the same subject. If you look at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, when Dante the Pilgrim first meets his hero, right, Virgil, wow, is this really you? Can I have your autograph, etc.? And he said, well, why did you come here? He's in the dark wood. He's in hell. And Virgil tells him, basically, I was sent by Beatrice, right? This young girl he's written about. And this is what Virgil records Beatrice's words. Love moves me. Love makes me speak. Right? So this is what she told. This is why her love for Dante, who is in a dark wood of error, dark wood of sin, leads her to send Virgil, so maybe he'll listen to you, basically. And so she hoped the Latin poet could help her beloved reorient his will, his affections, and his intellect towards the supreme good. Francesca, on the other hand, mimics those words, but with a completely different effect. She repeats the word love 3 times for rhetorical emphasis. Her verbal skill empties the Trinitarian register of its transcendent meaning. Again, don't have time to go into the numerological symbolism of the Divine Comedy. There are 3 parts to it. They're written in tercets. There are 33 cantos. They're all a homage to the Trinity, right, in verse form. So here, when you repeat a word like love 3 times, then you cannot miss it. So she uses that triple repetition, but the effect is deadly, right? Because what she does is empty the word love of its true meaning. The object she adores turns out to be the profane god of her own illicit desire. When love is not kindled by virtue, as Virgil will later insist it must to be authentic, it becomes the destructive impulse that drove precisely Dido in the Aeneid to madness and to a fiery death. While Dante promptly faints on learning the equally unhappy ending of Francesca's story, he soon realizes that misplaced pity kills piety and closes the mind to truth. In his Confessions, Augustine also ruefully described his sympathy for Dido's unrequited love as the height of folly. Sentimentalism makes one an accomplice in the sin of folle amor, foolish or mad love. The moral lesson contained in what Charles William calls this the Francescan moment, right? So there's the Beatrician moment and the Francescan moment. So there's a sharp contrast between the two. Really hits home with Dante the Pilgrim. He too had written love poetry. As a matter of fact, one of his early collection of poetry was called, in the original, Rime Petrose, stony rhymes, dedicated to a stony lady who turned his heart into stone. So there are a lot of puns on the word stone and stony. And then in an earlier book called On the Vernacular, De Vulgaria Eloquentia, Dante is the father of the Italian language, just as Chaucer is considered to be the father of the English language. So, but that's another story. But there in that book, he identified the ardor of love as a legitimate subject matter for poets to explore. One of the main aims of poetry, he claimed, is, and I quote him, directio voluntatis, meaning both the rightness and the writing of the will, writing with an R, right, in the right direction. So his poetry, as one commentator puts it, is accordingly addressed to the will of man, directing it to the good. Any action that is not ordered to the good is false. The figure of Beatrice teaches the same lesson to Dante in the Vita Nuova, and it is one her pupil will have to relearn in the Divine Comedy, because when we meet him at the beginning, as I was saying, he finds himself in a dark wood. He's in a rut, and he doesn't know how to get out of it, and he needs help. T.S. Eliot, for one, was astonished at the tender age this unforgettable experience occurred, that is, Dante's first meeting with Beatrice. And here I quote Eliot. It's rather amusing in parts. He says, in the first place, the type of sexual experience which Dante describes as occurring to him at the age of 9 years old is by no means impossible or unique. My only doubt, in which I found myself confirmed by a distinguished psychologist, is whether it could have taken place so late in life as 9 years old. The psychologist agreed with me that it is more likely to occur at about 5 or 6 years of age. It is possible that Dante developed rather late, and it is also possible that he altered the dates to employ some other significance of the number 9. He hit the nail right on the head. This was the case. As we have noted, a series of seemingly random encounters with his beloved Beatrice, some real, some dreamlike, puncture the narrative that Dante calls his book of memory, La Vita Nuova. In retrospect, these memorable occurrences seem divinely arranged, each illumined by the spiritually symbolic number 9. Gradually, Dante learns to refer Beatrice's physical beauty to its divine source, and to see his beloved as a new creation, that is, as the expression of God's grace. Beatrice is consequently described as being, and here I'm quoting various adjectives he uses in his narrative, Beatrice is gracious, she is miraculous, and she's always accompanied by the number 9. By analogy, Dante writes, and here I quote him, she was a 9, that is, a miracle whose root is solely the wondrous Trinity, unquote. So in Dante's unique view, a man may reach God through love of a wise woman. A wise man with ladies does the same, he adds. So Beatrice's salutation, meaning both greeting and salvation in the original Italian, her greeting on the streets of Florence, connects the story of Dante's life in time to the plot of the divine author that the divine author writes in eternity. As a result, even the death of Beatrice is no longer traumatic when viewed providentially. Human tragedy becomes a divine comedy. Now, upon reviewing this essay of Eliot that I was referring to a moment ago on Dante, Chesterton, to go back to him, reflected on the significance of the traditional theme of love at first sight presented in the New Life, or the Vita Nuova. And here I quote Chesterton. The man, or rather boy, who remembered with such scorching delight the fact that a little girl had nodded and smiled at him on a particular morning, and with such scorching despair the fact that she had not nodded or smiled at him on another morning, was most certainly in love. It was first love, calf love, moon calf love, no doubt, but certainly human love. And if it wasn't, I will modestly exclaim with Shakespeare, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. Chesterton knew firsthand this experience of falling head over heels in love, so he wasn't just speaking academically. In a letter he wrote to a friend, Chesterton described how he behaved when he was courting his future wife, Frances. And here I'm quoting an account of the letter. So here goes. He awoke in the morning, washed his boots in hot water, put shoe polish on his face instead of on his boots, went to breakfast and poured hot coffee on the sardines, and put his hat on the fire to boil. And when he left his house by way of the chimney rather than the front door, his family figured out that something or someone was on his mind. And indeed there was. Right? Now, before we dismiss this account as nothing but tomfoolery, Chesterton pointed out that the great joy a gentleman experiences upon falling in love has in it the sense of immortality. All lovers think of their love as being endless. He describes these experiences, Chesterton does, as, quote, moments filled with eternity. They are joyful because they do not seem momentary. All young lovers experience, in other words, a Beatrician moment, which Charles Williams defined as a moment of revelation and communicated conversion by means of a girl. But again, as Williams points out, Dante's spiritual movement is the pattern of Beatrice's. Reverse the name and it holds. This affirmative way, as he calls it, the affirmative way to God, through creatures, through creation. There's also something called the negative way in theology. It's by renouncing all the goods of the earth, but that's another story. So he says this spiritual movement is a pattern of Beatrice. Reverse the name and it holds. This affirmative way holds true, Williams maintained, in all human relationships, in marriage, in a family, in friendship. And Lewis commented on this valuable insight of his friend Williams, and this is what he wrote. The intense significance Beatrice appears to have is not an illusion. In her, at that moment, paradise is actually revealed. and in the lover nature is renovated. The greater danger is lest he should mistake the vision, which is really a starting point, for the goal. Lest he should mistake the vision of paradise for the arrival there. And Lewis continues. He says, the Beatrician experience does not usually last. Dante's Beatrice died. I forgot to mention that in the Vita Nuova, she dies at a very young age, right? And so he has a vision, Dante has a vision of her after her death, but I'll come back to that. Dante's Beatrice died, but even had she lived, the story would have been much the same. The glory is temporary, in the sense that Beatrice nearly always dies. And this is the key point, I think, that Lewis makes. But a transitory vision is not necessarily a vision of the transitory. That it passes does not really necessarily prove it is an hallucination. It has, in fact, been a glimpse of what is eternally real. The phenomenal Beatrice as she is in the fallen world, that is in the world of phenomena, has for an instant been identical with the real Beatrice. Unquote. So Dante, no less than Chesterton, was starry-eyed. As a matter of fact, again, with the symmetry, the great genius that he had, if you look at the three parts of the Divine Comedy, you'll see that each part ends with the word stelle, stars, to indicate the aspiration of the soul, the destination, where he wants to reach. And in the course of his journey, Dante learns to redirect his salutary love for Beatrice, what he calls the bliss and end of all my desires in the Vita Nuova, towards the divine point on which heaven depends, the goal and end of all desires, as he calls it at the end of the Paradiso, when he actually reaches paradise, and those wonderful final lines that Lewis and Eliot and others have called the finest lines in all of poetry, by the way. So, and they are, Dante enjoys the beatific vision. His desire and will revolve in a circular motion of a wheel whose hub, and these are the words, the love that moves the sun and the other stars. He aligns himself, right, with those. So this kind of redemptive love can be distorted, however, since, as Williams points out, the lover is free not to follow the way that leads to salvation, right? Beatrice's name said the greeting, salvation, right? He can choose not to. Because, as Williams puts it, Beatrice is a moment of choice between romanticism and pseudo-romanticism. Now, according to Chesterton, the British romantic poets misinterpreted the goal of the Pilgrim's Journey. As a matter of fact, the British romantics were directly responsible for the rekindling of interest on the English side of things of Dante renewal, right? But according to Chesterton, they misread him. And this is what he says. For the romantics of the 19th century really implied that God and the universe, heaven, hell, and purgatory were all one elaborate and rather laborious complement to Beatrice. It is truer to say that in the true sense, Beatrice is a complement to God. She is lifted like flowers on an altar or flames on a candlestick to be an example of that earthly beauty which, used rightly, can lead us to heavenly beauty. They did not use the coarse cant of our day, but they did, in fact, make sex the supreme end of life for its own sake. They therefore miss the whole meaning of Dante, which is that human love may indeed be a new life, but the new life must be dedicated to the supreme good as much as the old life. All other goods are only manifestations of that supreme good, and must ultimately be referred to it as Beatrice is referred to the beatific vision, unquote. So the contrast between the Beatrician moment and the Francescan moments, as Williams calls them, couldn't be starker. And as a matter of fact, after Beatrice's premature death as a young woman, Dante has a vision of her sitting at the foot of God's throne that makes the poet resolve he would no longer say anything about what he calls this blessed one until he would develop a way of writing that would do her justice. Now, blessed in the original Italian, beata, is a pun on the name of Beatrice, which Dante repeats in his final verse of the Vita Nuova. He He says, then if it be pleasing to him as the Lord, who is the Lord of benevolence and grace, may my soul go to contemplate the glory of its lady, that blessed Beatrice, who gazes in glory into the face of him qui est per omnia saecula benedictus, who is blessed forever and ever. Dante refers the light he sees shining on his beloved back to its divine source, or, to use an analogy from C.S. Lewis himself, the mind of the medieval lover runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. And again, notice, lover tells each other, and here with apologies to fans of the Stevie Wonder song, you are the sunshine of my life. You are the sunshine of my life. Notice he doesn't say you are the sun of my life, right? Because the sun is an old symbol going back as far as Plato for God. So it's divine love, right? You are the sunshine of only the sunshine, right? And again, this is what Lewis himself wrote after his conversion. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. So there's a great distinction between the two. And Lewis believed, and I quote him again, every created thing is in its degree an image of God, and the ordinate and faithful appreciation of that thing, a clue which truly followed, will lead back to him. Lewis, therefore, would have agreed with Chesterton's assessment of Dante's achievement as an amatory poet. The Vita Nuova really was the new life. There had been nothing exactly like it before in all the history of love, because of what I've just been saying. And why? Because woman was no longer an idol to be worshipped from afar in the courtly love tradition. She was a creature who could inspire a man to overcome his base desires and to strive for virtue, or what, again, Charles Williams called, she acts as a God-bearing image. She's only an image that leads, towards that higher love. And Williams, in fact, admired Lewis's own scholarly contribution on the subject of medieval troubadour poetry, a book called The Allegory of Love, which he published in 1936, which he praised as the best book since Dante on the subject. Augustine's notion, then, that human hearts are restless because they have God-shaped holes that yearn to be filled haunted Lewis's imagination. In The Great Divorce, Lewis reenacts what Dorothy Sayers called the drama of the soul's choice. One presented the dynamic of love and moral responsibility. MacDonald defines freedom for the fictional Lewis in the novel by recalling the words of Beatrice addressed to the pilgrim Dante on the same subject. It's the gift, he says, whereby you most resemble your Maker, and you yourselves are parts of eternal reality. Virgil had prefaced his remarks, as we've already seen, by explaining that freedom enters into every intentional act and provides the basis on which we hold people responsible for the consequences of what they do. The free agent innately seeks good, the object of the will, but the fall weakened the intellect's power of discernment and the will's capacity to choose rightly. Only divine grace can purge away evil inclinations and thereby restore the will to good. The pilgrim accordingly fulfills his quest by freely conforming his own will to God's. For as Augustine wrote, in his good will is our peace, in the Confessions, and Dante repeats that phrase in the Divine Comedy. So the good or bad choices people make, as MacDonald points out in The Great Divorce, will inevitably affect their eternal destinies. And here's a concise version of what he says. There are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. The author of Freedom respects the pattern of free choices his creatures make during a lifetime and ratifies them in eternity. Lewis illustrates the interplay between love and freedom in the culminating episode of his novel, where Frank meets his wife, Sarah Smith, in the same way that Dante meets Beatrice on Mount Purgatory after 10-year separation. And again, Lewis borrows some atmospheric details. I don't have time to go into all of the scene, but one of the most moving is when Frank sees his wife, and he says, is it the same thing that Dante says when he sees Beatrice? This is 10 years after she's died. Okay, he can't believe his eyes, right? So, and there are a number of other intertextual echoes that Lewis uses to make the connection unmistakable. And the answer that Dante is given is, look, it's really me. I am Beatrice. Your eyes aren't playing tricks on you. And it's the same thing here in this scene between a husband and wife who have been separated. And Lewis changes some things in the scene in the Divine Comedy. Beatrice will scold. I'll get to that too in a moment. Will scold what she calls her prodigal lover. But here it's Sarah who asks forgiveness of her husband. And so again, it's to emphasize that point that Beatrice's defects don't come into the picture, as William said in Dante, because the pattern, the journey is the same. It doesn't matter if it's male or female, right? It's there. And here we have Lewis playing on that idea that it's really Sarah Smith who's made this journey like Dante did. But Sarah's great challenge, however, consists in encouraging her husband to purge his disordered desires and then to raise them gradually to eternal love. And so she explains to Frank, I am in love himself. I am in love himself. You shall be the same. But Frank resists this Beatrician overture. Says, love? How dare you use that sacred word, Frank says. You do not love me. Sarah replies, if it were possible, I would go down with you into hell. But you cannot bring hell into me. I am in love, and out of it I will not go. So the narrator goes on to say that Frank's is one of those people who rejects joy and always insists on keeping something for himself, even at the price of misery. But Sarah won't go for this. She won't go against joy. And this is also the case for another character in The Great Divorce named Pam, who blames God for not having taken her son, for having rather taken her son Michael away from her. This is a very poignant scene that would take a lot of time to describe, but here I'll just give you the essence. But she fails to take into account that the grieving of both her husband and her daughter, who had also loved Michael. Like Frank, Pam battles against joy and declares, and this is what she says, I believe in a God of love. No one has a right to come between me and my son, not even God. I want my boy, and I mean to have him. He is mine, do you understand? Mine, forever and ever. The triple repetition of the word mine, once again, registers the moral lesson George MacDonald imparts to his pupil about how even the most natural of affections, which spring from a good heart, can, quote, go bad when they set up on their own and make themselves into false gods. And even though Lewis emphasizes for one last time the self-choice that creates hell in exchange between married partners, he does not conclude the Great Divorce on this tragic note. Frank is not given the last word on the subject of eternal salvation, for as MacDonald points out, the misery in hell cannot veto the happiness in heaven which love generates. And this remains Sarah's firm conviction. Her heart longs for the holy other and expands until it rests in the love that enamored her mind. So I've just chosen those few passages from Lewis, The Great Divorce, to set the stage for the final novel here, and I will be also choosing representative scenes from them. This 1956 novel, Lewis says he re-examines in one of his letters the inherent dialectic of desire, as he puts it. This was his last novel, and of course it failed to achieve the popular success of works such as Narnia Chronicles or even the Space Trilogy. But Lewis considered Till We Have Faces what we might call the ugly duckling of his imaginative fiction. And this is what he wrote to a correspondent in 1960. It is far and away the best I have written. And in this last novel, what Lewis does is retell the ancient Cupid and Psyche myth with the aim of charting, again, the protagonist's changing perceptions of love. Or the main character, who the book is divided into two. The first part is a long complaint that this protagonist who's writing her memoirs, her name is Orual, and she's got a beef against the gods. And then this is the longer part, and then a very short second part of the novel. And so we move in shorthand at the beginning, Orual's spiritual progress from seeing what she calls the ruinous face of the goddess Ungut to beholding the most dreadful, the most beautiful face of the god of love. And it recapitulates Dante's journey that I've described in a few brushstrokes there. And if you read that first part, the complaints, they really add up. And you would think, boy, she would never get beyond this culture of complaints, right? Complain about this, that, and the other. And there are a number of paradigmatic child scenes where she appears before the mirror and she witnesses her physical ugliness, and they become key points in the whole novel and narrative. And when she looks at herself in one of the first scenes, she says, "We bring our ugliness with us in the world, with it our destiny." In her view, the gods treat men and women as mere playthings, inflicting pain upon them unjustly and indiscriminately. To satisfy their bloodlust, moreover, they demand human sacrifice. So when her beloved sister, Psyche, that's her name, the chosen scapegoat, appeases Ungut, who is the local equivalent of the goddess Venus, goddess of love, by agreeing to wed her son Cupid, the so-called shadow brute, Orual cites the barbaric practice as prima facie evidence of the unspeakable horror of divine things. As a rationalist, Orual claims the gods are mere figments of the imagination, and yet, ironically, she blames these vengeful imaginary beings for causing human suffering and her personal misery. But her strategy of putting the gods on the dock, to borrow a phrase from Lewis, backfires. In later visionary scenes, because she has a number of visionary scenes, just as we see in The Great Divorce. So what Lewis does is use techniques that is from The Great Divorce and the Dream Vision, which is a medieval literary strategy as well, most pronouncedly in Divine Comedy, as we've been saying. So here she stands once again in one of these visionary scenes before a mirror in an infernal setting. And instead of seeing her own face, she sees the face of the goddess Ungut, the goddess she abhors the most. She says, "The vision, without question, was true. It was I who was Ungut. The ruinous face was mine." The hideous specular image exposes not only her physical ugliness, but also the base motives of her actions. Ironically, Orual comes to realize that she treated all her loved ones, including her beloved sister Psyche, with the same selfishness and cruelty that she had previously attributed to the gods. To say that I was Ungut meant that I was ugly in soul as she was, greedy, blood-gorged. Following this remarkable about-face, roles in the court proceeding are reversed. The accuser becomes the accused. Spellbound by the mirror image of her own moral corruption, Orual becomes a Medusa figure, turning her own heart to stone. Remember those stony rhymes of Dante. So I won't go into all the Dantesque allusions here either, except to say that at one point in the Divine Comedy, when Dante the Pilgrim is meeting the various inhabitants of hell who tell him their story, just as Francesca did in Inferno 5, as I was mentioning, he comes to to meet the counterfeiters here at one point, and they're there, and they see their moral deformity in what is called a mirror of Narcissus, and it's a pool that reflects their hideous selves. And so you remember the story of Narcissus, this beautiful youth who sees his image walking by the river, sees an image as he's bending down, and he doesn't know who it is. And I guess he didn't know how to swim because he tried to grasp it and he drowned. So it's a tragic story. And then there's his girlfriend, whose name is Echo, echoes sorrow throughout after this occurrence. So here, what Dante is doing is when the sinners in hell see a true image of themselves as before a mirror, which Lewis, I think, represents in Till We Have Faces, is also reminiscent of a very pivotal moment in Augustine's Confession, when he has a similar, what we call a mirror moment or epiphany before the mirror. And this is the relevant passage from the Confessions that you probably will remember. While Ponticianus was speaking, O Lord, you were turning me around to look at myself, for I had placed myself behind my own back, refusing to see myself. You were setting me before my own eyes so that I could see how sordid I was, how deformed and squalid, how tainted with ulcers and sores. I saw it all and stood aghast. So this is Augustine speaking about seeing the true face of his soul, right, basically. And it's a kind of negative narcissism, as one commentator has put it, because if the soul refuses grace, it becomes petrified, stone of the heart, in horror and despair. And that's precisely the challenge that Dante also meets before the figure of Medusa, whom he meets in hell as well. So the horrific vision of Ungut serves as an analog for the same experience that we see until we have faces. And so what Dante does, he has to immerse himself in a river, and of course it's an image for a baptism, right? He has to be cleansed of his sins and so on. And Aurore faces a similar moment when the god stops her from trying to commit suicide. And he tells her by a river, interestingly enough, and it's spiritual suicide. Do not do it. You cannot escape Ungut by going to the Deadlands, for she is there also. Die before you die. There is no chance after. The oracle, although it's cryptic, it really provides a hopeful script for her innermost self. And this is what she concludes. I should change my ugly soul into a fair one, and this, the gods helping me, I would do. I would set about it at once. So that is the turning point for her, right? That where she does this. So this radical change of heart depends on getting rid of the old self, mired in the life of sin, and to use St. Augustine's analogy from the Confessions and offering it up in sacrifice, slaying it. And similarly, Aurore kills her egocentric love by performing selfless acts of service for her sister. So when Cupid, the god of love, exiles Psyche, her sister, and assigns various tasks to her for breaking his command not to bring light into the bedchamber, Aurore generously lends a helping hand. And so there are a number of dream visions here. And so through this medium of dreams, we see the god demanding of Aurore to fill a bowl with water from the Deadlands as a votive offering to Ungut. And when Aurore is searching for the fountains that flow into the rivers of the classical underworld, she is granted a vision of Psyche, who in a gesture of reciprocating love is carrying the empty bowl for her. While the two sisters, and when they're not unable to accomplish this mission, an eagle is sent as a divine messenger to help them carry it out and release her from this horrible gaze of Ungut's, right, on her. So she's released from this. And Oriole will become, as the god says, another Psyche. So the whole process is described there. And I will skip a number of parts there in order to get to the main points. So basically, she believes that this God whom her sister has asked sacrifice of her sister is a shadow brute. That's the word that I've quoted. And yet when she sees him, when he lights, is a face of beauty. It's completely the opposite of what she had expected. A monster, the shadow brute that I and all the kingdom of Gloam had imagined would have subdued me less than the beauty his face wore. So her quest for her own personal beauty leads her to the source of universal beauty, foreshadowing the final epiphany of the face that will fill her with new terror, new joy, overpowering sweetness. Right? When the God first appeared to her, these are her words, and I'm sure they remind you of another character from the divine, from the Great Divorce. Jealous of Psyche, because they've told her that. Not while she was mine. We want to be our own. Psyche was mine, and no one else has a right to her. You stole her to make her happy. She was mine. Mine, I tell you. You're blood drinkers and man-eaters. Right? So she echoes those words of Pam, the mother that we saw in the Great Divorce. And she foregrounds her own desire for mastery and possession of another human being. And this is a distorted view, according to Lewis himself. In the Four Loves, he puts it this way: God becomes the great rival, the ultimate object of human jealousy, that beauty terrible as the Gorgons, which may at any moment steal from me, or it seems like stealing to me, my wife's or husband's or son's or sister's heart. So ironically, Oriole's possessive love for Psyche denies her sister the very autonomy that she coveted, right? And when she says, I am my own, George MacDonald, this is not the fictional writer, but George MacDonald is writing, called that phrase the one principle of hell. Because nobody is their own. We're all derived beings, he says. And so what Oriole does is that she cannot yet comprehend the one love that augments all human loves. And Lewis commented on this passage from Dante's Purgatorio. For in this love, to divide is not to take away. That is, love of the good increases, paradoxically, the more it is shared or divided. You know? Just think of the Grinch, right, with his heart shrivels, right? And I forgot the name of the little girl. Is it Cindy Boo-Hoo, right? So when he sees her, the heart expands, right? So if you turn inwards, it shrinks, it's not love, right? And this is what happens, and this is what Lewis is commenting on. He says, when you share it with others, it is not divided, it grows exponentially. So this is what he does, what Lewis does in probing the disordered loves of Oriole throughout till we have loves. And she repents eventually. And this is what she tells her sister, and this is a key moment for her. O Psyche, never will I call you mine, but all there is of me shall be yours. I never wished you well, never had one selfless thought of you. I was a craver. So focusing her gaze on other people rather than herself, and her name, by the way, according to some critics, is derived from the French word orval for the aromatic herb meaning clear eye, interestingly enough, helps her recover a clear vision of the reality of things apart from herself. So the cleansing of her interior eye allows Oriole to experience this epiphany of beauty through the eyes of faith. And the supernatural vision of the purified heart prompts Oriole to accept the evidence of things unseen. For as St. Augustine observed, We see the things which you have made, Lord, because they exist, but they only exist because you see them. Right? This is from a passage from the Confession. And similarly, Oriol goes through the same process, and in an ironic twist of faith, she realizes that she exists only through God and in his sight as well. So Lewis plays on this image of vision. I won't go through what Dante does in the Divine Comedy as well, but he uses these images of face and mirror to convey the successive stages of Oriol's progress from spiritual darkness and unbelief to the marvelous light of unveiling. She wears a veil throughout the narrative, right, because of her ugliness. And the citizens of the Citizen of Gloam spread various rumors about her. But again, this use of the veil is very reminiscent of what we see in the Old Testament. The veil was literally the cover of the radiant face of Moses after he had been speaking to God, and figuratively the relationship between the letter of the Old Testament and the spirit of the new, who is Christ, as St. Paul says in the second letter to Corinthians. So the conversion of Scripture by means of a retrospective illumination is analogous to Oriol's revision of her autobiographical scroll in the light of her own conversion. And this is what she says: it would be better to rewrite it from the beginning, that large first part that I've talked about. The past which I wrote down was not the past that I thought I had all these years been remembering, her book of memory. I did not, even when I had finished the book, see clearly many things that I see now, quote unquote. So in her book of memory, and as in Dante's, vision is a kind of hermeneutic metaphor for this interpretive glance backward that activates the eyes of the soul. And Oriol cannot face the God or detect the origin of beauty because she equates from the outset justice with revenge, just like the ancient Greeks did. And at one point, she asks her tutor, who's steeped in Greek wisdom, says, "Are the gods not just?" And he asks her, "Oh no, child, what would become of us if they were?" Right? It's charity, not justice, right? So the fox's answer shows that things don't work according to the law of retribution. For as Thomas Aquinas pointed out in the Summa, justice without mercy is cruel. And again, Serres has this commentary on Dante's work about what she calls the just vengeance. Right? There's only one just vengeance. And she says, this forced God's repayment of debt for humanity's sins. And she says it was wholly just and wholly unjust, because insofar as it represents God's judgment of man, it is absolute justice. Insofar as it represents man's judgment of God, it is absolute injustice, right? So here the tables are turned on Oriol. So the pagan god Cupid, again in this revision, working backwards, becomes a participant somehow, as one critic has pointed out, in the Christian fabric of exchange and mercy, working backwards from Christ's life and death in parallel with Oriol's working backwards. And again, Lewis had this idea of what myth was, and he talks about it in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, this myth of the dying God. And the image he uses, interestingly enough, is of a story, not that it's untrue, the phrase he uses is gradually coming into focus, right? And he says, first you get scattered through the primitive religions all over the world, but still quite vague and mythical, the idea of a God who is killed and come to life again. And then the dying God really appears as an historical person, living in a definite place and time. And it's interesting that even Plato in the Republic talked about this, what would happen to the truly just man. They will say that our just man will be scourged, racked, fettered, will have his eyes burned out, and at last, after all manner of suffering, will be crucified. I quote Plato. So just as Socrates says in another work of Plato's, the Phaedrus, justice appears ugly at first, but the more one comes to love it, the more one comes to find it beautiful. And this is the paradox that even the church fathers, patristic commentary, wrestled with. They were trying to reconcile the representation of the coming Messiah, who is addressed in Psalm 45 as the fairest of children of men, and grace is poured upon his lips, with the key passage from the prophet Isaiah of the suffering servant. How do you reconcile those two, right? The terrible beauty, so to speak. He had neither beauty nor majesty, nothing to attract our eyes, no grace to make us delight in him. And what that he concluded was that the splendid image of Christ's spousal relationship with his members of his mystical body is contrasted, though not contradicted, by the altered appearance of the man of sorrows. And Augustine commented that the beautiful bridegroom appeared ugly on account of our ugliness. And Aquinas added that the beauty in the biblical figure was hidden because of the infirmity he assumed. So the disfigured face of the suffering Christ was understood to reflect the beauty of love that goes to the extreme limit of embracing pain and death. And his infinite desire to redeem humanity on the cross gladdened him according to Dante's beautiful oxymoron, at the moment he uttered Eli, his cry of dereliction. And Lewis himself said, the mere kindness which tolerates anything except suffering stands at the opposite pole from love, which he capitalizes. So those two protagonists, two sisters become one. They reenact this redemptive love. They become a living sacrifice for each other. And it sets the stage, and I'll conclude with this, where the aureole is at the very end, and her complaint ends before the God of love, and she will say the following. And he was coming, the most dreadful, the most beautiful. The only dread and beauty there is was coming. So she experiences the fear that is described as the beginning of wisdom and the source of blessedness, as she contemplates the face of the love for whose sake, and this is in Lewis's text, the earth and stars and sun existed. So what Lewis has done at the very end of the novel is conflate two visions of love that Dante, one that he uses in the Vita Nuova, and the one at the end of the Divine Comedy that I've already talked about. And so here, where the love that moves the sun and the other star also is here. And there's also a revision in the sense of not just looking, but also in the process of writing, in revising the text, as we've been saying. And here it's a collaborative effort, requiring the guidance of another hand, that of Providence itself, that both writes and is written of, however tacitly in the telling. The corrective pen marks Aureole, therefore, finds on the crooked lines of her awkward scrawl highlight her grave errors of judgment. Aureole had formerly believed that divine nature wounds and perhaps destroys us merely by being what it is. I quote those words. That is to say, she previously attributed her suffering to the wrath of the gods. The gods, however, now use their editorial pen as a scalpel to temper the litigant's lacerating words with the balm of mercy and translate her text into a better, more charitable language. They function in a manner reminiscent of T.S. Eliot's figure in East Coker 4, the Four Quartets, the figure of the wounded surgeon, who bears the marks of the pain he suffers for those he loves, and who applies, quote, the sharp compassion of the healer's art to the book of the human patient's life. The loving probity of the divine penmanship reminds the wounded storyteller Oriol, that she is writing before the one, the ultimate judge, before whom all hidden motives are to be uncovered. As Tolkien once wrote in a letter to C.S. Lewis, the only just literary critic is Christ, who admires more than any man the gifts he has himself bestowed. And again, rendering full justice, I won't go into this other part, but this theorist Bakhtin says, God's last word descending upon the dying person is salvation or damnation. Then in my last word, Bakhtin writes, I turn to the outside and surrender myself to the mercy of the other, the ultimate deathbed confession. Oriol had demanded, Oriol's manuscript, if you look at the end of the novel, breaks off. And one of the priests discovers it. And it ends off in mid-sentence. Since the word she seeks to hear in the final exchange is, to use Walter Benjamin's apt formulation, less an answer to a question than a proposal concerning the continuation of a story that is just unfolding. Consequently, her old verbal battle with the gods ceases. I ended my first book, she wrote, with the words, no answer. She had only experienced words upon words, but now understands why human speech proves inadequate in the ineffable presence of the divine word in person. You yourself are the answer. Before your face, all questions die away. So the face of her soul, unveiling the true face of her soul, leads her to a direct vision of the God who alone could read her text authoritatively. Oriol has acted as the narrator of her own story, and she recognizes she's not the author of her whole life. She recognizes the limits of her own subjectivity and humbly acknowledges an authorship transcending her own. Oriol claimed, and here I quote, I'm ending here, for years that my life had been lived in two halves, never fitted together, the two parts of the book. In the endless ending of the novel, only the author and finisher of the story, the Alpha and the Omega, can join the two parts of the open-ended confession Oriol pens separately, unveil their full meaning, and bind them together with love in one volume. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Manganiello. It's been many years since I've had the pleasure of being one of your students, but one of the things that I was reminded of this evening was what our prayer for is for our students at Augustine College, which is that their loves will be set in order by the things that they read and the things that they study. And it's always seemed to me as a reader that loves are contagious and that it's important for us to follow the loves of wiser hearts and imaginations. So I thank you for sharing your loves of Lewis and Dante with us and for pointing us in the direction of the loves that they're pointing to, the love that moves the other stars, the sun and other stars. So thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you.